Sometimes a fisherman allows circumstance to trick him out of his usual ways. When this happens, he indulges in all sorts of whims and fantasies which belie however many years of waterside experience he may have had. Arthur Ransome, for all his wisdom, was no exception. And in Rod and Line, he tells us of just such a false and beckoning circumstance. Let us see where it leads us.
Fish, during the eclipse of 1927, were rather disappointing. Their reactions to it were entirely negative, and as both before and after the eclipse, their positive activity was not great. Such difference in behaviour as was caused in them by the eclipse was less noticeable than it might have been. During previous eclipses, it had been observed that cattle stopped feeding, and that birds, mistaking the approaching shadow for evening, flew to their roosting places. Hens are said to be much worried by such phenomena.
Come on. I had hoped that the fish would show their feelings in some remarkable way. And in spite of previous testimony on the behavior of animals of other kinds, I'd somehow allowed my optimism, that is as important to the fisherman as his line, to persuade me that the trout would show their interest by coming to the top of the water. I thought that the astronomers royal of the fish would be about in prominent places, and that I might catch one, put him in a glass case, with a diagram of the obscured sun.
I could find no mention of the effect of the eclipse on fish, but if cattle stopped feeding, that would not necessarily mean that fish would do the same. And if birds flew to their roosting places, that would seem to mean that they thought night was upon them. And if fish should reason in the same way, there might, at 6:24 in the morning of the 29th of June, 1927, be a very satisfactory evening rise. In any case, it was my business to go and see. So I broke all rules by being on the water of the Tarn at 5:30 in the morning, thinking that, as there is to be no other such eclipse for some 70 years, I was not likely to break the rules in this way again, and could almost count on being forgiven for a first offence. I had left great quantities of human beings who were being affected by the eclipse in different ways. Between Settle and this place at that early hour, I had heard mouth organs, accordions, and at least one brass band. I had seen men walking up the hills as fast as if they wished to escape the shadow. I had seen other men practicing for looking at the sun by looking through smoked glass at the young women who accompanied them. I had, however, seen that a great many people were making use of the eclipse for their own livelihood. They were trying to entice motor cars into fields for their own profit. They were, at this unusual time, doing a roaring trade in lemonade and petrol. The Eclipse was giving them an improved chance of making a living, and they were grabbing at that chance with both hands. The fish, I thought, would probably do the same.
Just then, I saw a ginger cat going home in the dawn. I remembered that whereas the human beings had full knowledge of the approaching shadow, the cat had not. Or he would have been lurking out in the field to spring in the shadow of the moon on an unsuspecting rabbit.
The trout would be like the cat, not like the human beings, in that the darkness and the shadow would come upon them unawares.
A flock of geese moved, protesting from the tarn as I arrived. It was, of course, quite light. There was hardly a breath of wind. Here and there, the quiet rings on the water.
There were big clouds over the Yorkshire hills, but among them open spaces, dazzling with the glow of the rising sun. I put up for an evening rise, and with an occasional pull at the oars to help, drifted down the tarn, wetting my flies as I drifted and wondering what it was the fish were taking, seemingly close under but not on the surface of the water. It was very cold, and I landed and looked for a meadow pipit's nest and walked to keep warm. Where was it? At 5:40, I saw a fish rise. And again, a propitious sight. The sun showed through the clouds like a brass saucer out of which some mad hatter had taken a bite. A wind came up. The light was waning, but not much more noticeably than it often does under a thundercloud. The geese up on the hillside moved off rapidly. 3 human beings showed on the skyline far above me. The sheep stopped feeding and moved restlessly about in little groups. Fish still rose. Then the speed of events seemed to quicken. Everything went suddenly dark. The noise of the curlews, peewits, and small upland birds stopped. There was absolute silence. It was as if a roof had suddenly been put over the tarn. I had a glimpse of the shrouded sun, but no attention for it, casting carefully in places where a few moments before the fish had been rising, and watching and listening for the movement of a fish. The tarn was dead. I saw no rise and heard no rise. It was exactly like fishing a pool in a river over which a fisherman had inadvertently moved his own shadow. That, I think, is what the eclipse seemed to the trout. It was the sudden passing of a tremendous shadow, the shadow not of a cloud, but of a solid body, and they reacted to it exactly as they would to the shadow of a rod or a fisherman, and buried themselves in the weeds or the deepest water. The shadow passed, and the tarn was again in daylight, but it was 20 minutes later that I saw the first fish rise.
After that, the morning of the eclipse was an ordinary fishing morning, and one of the worst. One hooked himself in the tail and freed himself by tearing off 30 yards of line and bolting into the reed bed. Another hooked on the dropper, caught the tail fly in the weeds, and so freed himself.
I was very sleepy and was startled by the only good fish I met, who went off with half a cast and 2 of my best flies, tied specially for the eclipse. These things, unsatisfactory in themselves, were, however, enough to prove that trout, feeding normally before the eclipse, stopped feeding altogether at the passage of the moon's shadow, ceased to feed for about as long as when put down by the shadow of a careless fisherman, and, plucking up heart with the second dawn that day, resumed their feeding. All of which was precisely what might have been expected.